"Since when?" asked Thorndyke. "Since last Monday evening, when I had the pleasure of seeing you conversing with my friend Dr. Berkeley at the Inner Temple Gate, and then inferred that you were retained in the case. That was a circumstance that had not been fully provided for. May I offer you gentlemen a glass of sherry?" As he spoke he placed on the table a decanter and a tray of glasses, and looked at us interrogatively with his hand on the stopper. "Well, I don't mind if I do, Mr. Jellicoe," said Badger, on whom the lawyer's glance had finally settled. Mr. Jellicoe filled a glass and handed it to him with a stiff bow. Then, with the decanter still in his hand, he said persuasively, "Dr. Thorndyke, pray allow me to fill you a glass?" "No, thank you," said Thorndyke, in a tone so decided that the inspector looked round at him quickly, and as Badger caught his eye, the glass which he was about to raise to his lips suddenly became arrested and was slowly returned to the table untasted. "I don't want to hurry you, Mr. Jellicoe," said the inspector, "but it's rather late, and I should like to get this business settled. What is it that you wish to do?" "I desire," replied Mr. Jellicoe, "to make a detailed statement of the events that have happened, and I wish to hear from Dr. Thorndyke precisely how he arrived at his very remarkable conclusion. When this has been done, I shall be entirely at your service, and I suggest that it would be more interesting if Dr. Thorndyke would give us his statement before I furnish you with the actual facts." "I am entirely of your opinion," said Thorndyke. "Then, in that case," said Mr. Jellicoe, "I suggest that you disregard me and address your remarks to your friends as if I were not present." Thorndyke acquiesced with a bow, and Mr. Jellicoe, having seated himself in his elbow chair behind the table, poured himself out a glass of water, selected a cigarette from a neat silver case, lighted it deliberately, and leaned back to listen at his ease. "My first acquaintance with this case," Thorndyke began without preamble, "was made through the medium of the daily papers about 2 years ago. And I may say that, although I had no interest in it beyond the purely academic interest of a specialist in a case that lies in his particular specialty, I considered it with deep attention. The newspaper reports contain no particulars of the relations of the parties that could furnish any hints as to motives on the part of any of them, but merely a bare statement of the events. And this was a distinct advantage, inasmuch as it left one to consider the facts of the case without regard to motive, to balance the prima facie probabilities with an open mind. And it may surprise you to learn that those prima facie probabilities pointed from the very first to that solution which has been put to the test of experiment this evening. Hence it will be well for me to begin by giving the conclusions that I reached by reasoning from the facts set forth in the newspapers before any of the further facts came to my knowledge. From the facts stated in the newspaper reports, it is obvious that there were 4 possible explanations of the disappearance. 1. The man might be alive and in hiding. This was highly improbable, for the reasons that were stated by Mr. Loram at the late hearing for the application, and for a further reason that I shall mention presently. 2. He may have died by accident or disease, and his body failed to be identified. This was even more improbable, seeing that he carried on his person abundant means of identification, including visiting cards. 3. He might have been murdered by some stranger for the sake of his portable property. This was highly improbable for the same reason. His body could hardly have failed to be identified. These 3 explanations are what we may call the outside explanations. They touched none of the parties mentioned. They were all obviously improbable on general grounds, and to all of them there was one conclusive answer: the scarab which was found in Godfrey Bellingham's garden. Hence I put them aside, and gave my attention to the 4th explanation. This was that the missing man had been made away with by one of the parties mentioned in the report. But since the reports mentioned 3 parties, it was evident that there was a choice of 3 hypotheses, namely, A. That John Bellingham had been made away by Hurst, or B. by the Bellinghams, or C. by Mr. Jellicoe. Now, I have constantly impressed on my pupils that the indispensable question that must be asked at the outset of such an inquiry as this is, when was the missing person last undoubtedly seen or known to be alive? That is the question that I asked myself after reading the newspaper report, and the answer was that he was last certainly seen alive on the 14th of October, 1902, at 141 Queen Square, Bloomsbury. Of the fact that he was alive at that time and place, there could be no doubt whatever, for he was seen at the same moment by two persons, both of whom were intimately acquainted with him, and one of whom, Dr. Norbury, was apparently a disinterested witness. After that date he was never seen, alive or dead, by any person who knew him and was able to identify him. It was stated that he had been seen on the 23rd of November following by the housemaid of Mr. Hurst, but as this person was unacquainted with him, it was uncertain whether the person whom she saw was or was not John Bellingham. Hence the disappearance dated not from the 23rd of November, as everyone seems to have assumed, but from the 14th of October, and the question was not what became of John Bellingham after he entered Mr. Hurst's house, but what became of him after his interview in Queen Square. But as soon as I had decided that the interview must form the real starting point of the inquiry, a most striking set of circumstances came into view. It became obvious that if Mr. Jellicoe had had any reason for wishing to make away with John Bellingham, he had such an opportunity as seldom falls to the lot of an intending murderer. Just consider the conditions. John Bellingham was known to be setting out alone upon a journey beyond the sea. His exact destination was not stated. He was to be absent for an undetermined period, but at least 3 weeks. His disappearance would occasion no comment. His absence would lead to no inquiries, at least for several weeks, during which the murderer would have leisure quietly to dispose of the body and conceal all traces of the crime. The conditions were, from a murderer's point of view, ideal. But that was not all. During that very period of John Bellingham's absence, Mr. Jellicoe was engaged to deliver to the British Museum what was admittedly a dead human body, and that body was to be enclosed in a sealed case. Could any more perfect or secure method of disposing of a body be devised by the most ingenious murderer? The plan would have had only one weak point. The mummy would be known to have left Queen Square after the disappearance of John Bellingham, and suspicion might in the end have arisen. To this point I shall return presently. Meanwhile we will consider the second hypothesis, that the missing man was made away with by Mr. Hurst. Now, there seems to be no doubt that some person, purporting to be John Bellingham, did actually visit Mr. Hurst's house, and he must either have left the house or remained in it. If he left, he did so surreptitiously. If he remained, there could be no reasonable doubt that he had been murdered, and that his body had been concealed. Let us consider the probabilities in each case. Assuming, as everyone seems to have done, that the visitor was really John Bellingham, we are dealing with a responsible, middle-aged gentleman, and the idea that such a person would enter a house, announce his intention of staying, and then steal away unobserved is very difficult to accept. Moreover, he would appear to have come down to Eltham by rail immediately on landing in England, leaving his luggage in the cloakroom at Charing Cross. This pointed to a definiteness of purpose quite inconsistent with his casual disappearance from the house. On the other hand, the idea that he might have been murdered by Hurst was not inconceivable. The thing was physically possible. If Bellingham had really been in the study when Hurst came home, the murder could have been committed, by appropriate means, and the body temporarily concealed in the cupboard or elsewhere. But although possible, it was not at all probable. There was no real opportunity. The risk and the subsequent difficulties would be very great. There was not a particle of positive evidence that a murder had occurred, and the conduct of Hurst in immediately leaving the house in possession of the servants is quite inconsistent with the supposition that there was a body concealed in it. So that, while it is almost impossible to believe that John Bellingham left the house of his own accord, it is equally difficult to believe that he did not leave it. But there is a third possibility, which, strange to say, no one seems to have suggested. Supposing that the visitor was not John Bellingham at all, but someone who was impersonating him. That would dispose of the difficulties completely. The strange disappearance ceases to be strange, for a personator would necessarily make off before Mr. Hurst should arrive and discover the imposture. But if we accept this supposition, we raise two further questions. Who was the personator, and what was the object of the personation? Now, the personator was clearly not Hurst himself, for he would have been recognized by his housemaid. He was therefore either Godfrey Bellingham or Mr. Jellicoe, or some other person. And as no other person was mentioned in the newspaper reports, I confined my speculations to these two. And first, as to Godfrey Bellingham. It did not appear whether he was or was not known to the housemaid, so I assumed, wrongly, as it turns out, that he was not. Then he might have been the personator. But why should he have personated his brother? He could not have already committed the murder. There had not been time enough. he would have had to leave Woodford before John Bellingham